Okay, folks, let's get going. My name is David Parsons, and you are listening to Nostalgia Trap, and I thank you for doing so. We'll have plenty to say about the election of Donald Trump this week, but that will be on another episode. I'll be talking with Justin Rogers Cooper on the Patreon tomorrow and posting that episode. That'll be on Friday, November 8th. So if you're looking for takes, we'll have them for you. I myself feel a little taked out. I don't know about you. I felt a weird sense of relief and elation after the election, which is a weird thing to say because leading up to the election, I found myself filled with a lot of anger, mostly. I think that's my go-to emotion when it comes to sort of the affect of American politics. But after Trump won, I kind of felt like, I don't know, a sense that I don't need to be angry and I don't want to be angry anymore. And that's my main take right now, is kind of feeling like this is a point of moving on in one way or another from a certain sort of style of engaging with politics. I don't know if any of this will hold, but I wonder how all of you are doing. And I intentionally put a lot of our more intense critiques of the left in particular behind our Patreon paywall, in part because I don't want to hear like the commentariat engaging with that shit. And, you know, I'm just, looking at Instagram, looking at Facebook, looking at TikTok is sort of nauseating one way or the other. And I don't know, the sort of especially left liberal histrionics of sadness and rage. I just don't have the emotional energy for that. And I want to have my life be about other things. And that might sound like, I don't know, copping out or something to people, but I'm sure that we all need a break, right? So let's think about history today. And let's think about, I don't know, the way we've approached these issues on Nostalgia Trap over the years is by taking a longer view and by kind of zooming out and looking at the longer story. And this episode today is an opportunity to think about housing and the history of housing in America, and particularly the creation of the suburbs. This is a very different take on that story. I think we all think about Levittown, Long Island, New York, as this sort of suburb, right? The place where the first suburbs were built in the sort of post-war mode. But my guest today, Tim Keogh, is a historian, an assistant professor at Queensborough Community College, part of the CUNY network. And he is someone who's written a book that I think touches on this story in ways that might surprise you, and I think might connect with discussions we're going to have about why Trump won. The book is called In Levittown's Shadow: Poverty in America's Wealthiest Post-War Suburb. And it's about how poor people, service workers, people who are at the bottom of the economic ladder, how they fit into that post-war suburban housing boom in Long Island, New York. And again, there are a lot of surprises here. I think that in a lot of ways, dealing with the contradictions at the heart of the American project, for lack of a better term, is something that we should be thinking about beyond just the hot takes of rage and sadness and emotion in the wake of this election. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I learned a lot from it, and I honestly walked away from this talk with Tim thinking a lot about not just housing, but sort of the larger picture here. So I hope you enjoy this and learn from it. And I thank you for being a Nostalgia Trap listener. And again, Justin Rogers Cooper and I will be talking through more specifically the Trump election tomorrow when I post our News Trap episode for Friday, November 8th. So stay tuned for that. If you're not a Patreon subscriber, you should be, or at least I suggest it. I would like it if you subscribe to our show. It's only $5 a month, and you get access to at this point, hundreds of bonus episodes and conversations and videos and things like that, and my weekly News Trap updates. So thanks for those that are subscribing already, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Tim Keogh. Tim Keogh, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining me. How are you?
I'm good. A pleasure to be here.
We've been, I think, dancing around doing an episode together for a while. You've written a book that I want to say the name of before we even get started, because I think long-time Nostalgia Trap listeners will understand immediately why you and I are going to have a conversation about it. Your book is called In Levittown's Shadow, Poverty in America's Wealthiest Post-War Suburb. And it's the story of the other side. It's one of those history. I love those history books that are sort of like, here's a popular archetype, and here's the other side of it, and literally in the shadow. So it's about Long Island, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah. And part of it's personal. I grew up here. I was born here.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah. I'm back here during the pandemic. Part of it was definitely personal. But the other reason was because Long Island kind of is the quintessential post World War II suburb. It was the fastest growing place in America in the 1950s. It's home of literally Levittown, the kind of iconic suburb. So it just was the perfect place to kind of situate this story to kind of, as you said, kind of, peel away the layers of what we think of as suburbs and kind of how they really operated.
Yeah, when I think of, for those that don't immediately have that cultural sort of connection, that Levittown is sort of the prototypical suburb in the American imagination. I think of it specifically I think of like the Mad Men image of like Don Draper and Betty like living out in the suburbs, this bucolic place that's sort of like doing a very particular 1950s suburban white middle class life. But I think that part of what I wanted to talk about with you today is sort of, I live in suburbs and I've been in suburbs my whole life, and I've always noticed this sort of underclass that exists there. And you don't really hear so much about that or see so much about that in that bigger image. It's kind of amazing that we're still dealing with, I don't know, a flattened image of suburban life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think hopefully the book makes this point, but like, I think that flattened image kind of always serves like a political purpose. Yeah. Both the suburbs serve as this kind of, make America great again in the sense of like, the right wing idea of this bucolic, perfect, kind of family oriented neighborhoods we need to go back to, or kind of the source of a lot of America's problems. And, of course it is, absolutely, it is in terms of especially environmental issues, but at the same time, it's many times a symptom of larger problems rather than the source of it, I think. And that's kind of what I try to get at the book. We can kind of see the source of America's problems through the suburbs, but not like using the suburbs as our kind of, we beat it up essentially. And I think that's where we get it wrong. And that's what the idea of the book is.
Well, let's go back in time a little bit, because when I think of Long Island and the sort of longer history of suburban living, I think of like old Long Island, and like the image that comes to mind is like the Great Gatsby and like a lot of really, really rich people. And I'm talking about pre-1950s, pre-Levittown Long Island. What was that world like? Because it seems like your book is sort of touching on a transitional moment for Long Island that sort of somehow maintains the power structures that were already there. If that is that accurate?
Yeah, like essentially what I kind of argue is that the Levittown, right, the post-World War II, like the middle class, what we call the middle class, right, that was built both on federal intervention. Many people know that story. I can tell that again. But it's also built on this kind of class of low-wage workers who supported it and made it kind of possible. And that class of low-wage workers really came to be in that early 20th century. The difference is they no longer served the wealthiest people on the face of the earth. They increasingly served a pretty broad middle class across Long Island. So like you're talking about, the Great Gatsby is the great example, right? And that book does a pretty good job of encapsulating that kind of what they call the Gold Coast. Long Island, you could probably argue, I don't have the data for it, but you could probably argue it may have been the most unequal place on earth at the time, just because it was the home of every single rich family in the world, essentially. And not only Americans, but even European aristocrats who wanted to have an estate or mansion there. And I think from like the Queens border in northern Queens out to Suffolk County, which is there's Nassau County and there's Suffolk, there was about 600 mansions and estates that were like an uninterrupted sequence, which is mansion, 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 mansion. And the rest of the landscape was their playground. I mean, they had like country clubs. They had the biggest concentration of private golf courses. They had their own private highway, one of the first highways in America, the Long Island Motor Parkway, the Vanderbilt Parkway. They had their own aviation club, one of the earliest country clubs for people who, and I always kind of tell my students, like the reason why, I don't know if you know, Long Island's famous for some of the earliest like famous aviation firsts, like Charles Lindbergh took off here to go to Europe. A lot of the Earl Ovington is one like the first mail carrier plane and things like that. A lot of the first come Long Island. It's not because people say, oh, it's because it has a plains, the Hempstead Plains. It's like, well, a lot of places have flat land. It's not, that's not the reason. It's because rich people were here and they like to play with planes. That's essentially what it was.
Wow, I'm like imagining like Elon, the road to Elon Musk.
100% it is. Yeah, it's these kind of some of these people were kind of these kind of more kind of wild
adventurer, kind of Howard Hughes types. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and Lindbergh, you could say it was part of that, right? These adventurous kind of types. That cavorted around with millionaires, and so that's how they got their funding, and that's how these little factories opened up doing that stuff. But the point I'm making here is that there was this whole like estate economy that was devoted entirely to these wealthy people, their parties, their clubs, upkeeping their homes and gardens, watching their kids, and that involved thousands and thousands of people. I mean, one estate I have, Comstat, which is Marshall Fields. You're probably familiar with the Marshall stores. His estate had like 300 employees. It's like that's a Walmart supercenter, and that's just one estate.
Wow. And where are these employees living?
So they're living in two places. They're either living in really tenements. I mean, they look just like tenements on the Lower East Side. And they were like these dilapidated units that were like literally hugged the train tracks on Long Island. Because again, before the modern highway system, a lot of these suburbs were commuter suburbs for like these upper middle class people. And so they literally lived in these tenement housing conditions. Or if they were, I guess you call it luckier, they end up moving into unincorporated areas. These were not like the villages or the estate mansion neighborhoods. These were kind of just like farmlands that they would, sometimes farmers or developers would buy out farmland and they'd chop it up and subdivide it. And then they'd sell it to working class people who, might build their own house. I mean, I have instances in the book where people are literally building their own little, we call shack, like a small house. And that's the way they kind of avoid those really harsh conditions and those really high rents in those tenements. So kind of
Long Island. This is a fair comparison, but it sounds like antebellum slavery, and like in terms of like this sort of like you have this big plantation where the really, really ultra rich people live, and then this sort of army of workers who are kind of around and have to be fed and have to be housed and things like that. But there's sort of like there's a makeshift element to it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a scholar, Richard Harris, who's like a geographer, does like he talks about this kind of housing arrangements across the world, and he talks a lot about it being like gap tooth like development, where like you have a house, then you have like just a farm, then you have two other shacks, and then like you have road and train tracks, and you have this beautiful residential subdivision. And it looks a lot like the developing world today, where you have these wealthy people in Bangladesh or whatever in neighborhoods, and then outside of them are these teeming
something so insane about it, because like the rich people there are like obviously the servants are there to make their lives possible, and yet you can have the rich people looking out from their estate and being like, God, look at the horror that's outside of our beautiful estate. And it's like, yeah, but that's the people that are making your lives possible.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that the idea of looking out. In the Gatsby, there's that famous part of the book where they go through the Valley of Ashes. I don't know if you remember that at all, right?
Yeah, and it's actually I think depicted in the recent the Leo movie, the like Baz Luhrmann film. Yeah. I was struck by that because I'd never really seen sort of a visual depiction of what that might look like. I mean, obviously it's a Hollywood sort of production of it, but the idea that there's like some sort of like flatlands where things are sort of I don't know, really rough. There's not a lot of roads. It just kind of seems like people are kind of making their own way there.
Yeah, and so it's funny because the Gatsby, obviously it was metaphorical too, right? And it was supposed to be based on Flushing Meadows Park, which before Robert Moses made it a park, it was this ash heap where literally garbage was incinerated and dumped there. And of course, all these wealthy people had to travel through that ash heap to get to their wealthy suburbs. But a lot of ways where Fitzgerald lived, which was in Great Neck or Great Neck Estates, which is right outside of Queens, Nassau County, he wouldn't have to go through the ash heap to see those kind of living conditions. They were in Great Neck Estates; they were right around where he lived. Again, I imagine he used that metaphorically, but you didn't have to even travel through Queens to see those conditions. They were everywhere, as you said. Someone on a train station, between two suburban train stations, what they'd see out their window are people using, Ben Franklin stoves to heat their homes, and a pump and outside to get water. It would be a few blocks away because it had to be. This is the point. People are working 12, 14-hour shifts cleaning these people's homes. They're not getting on a train, an expensive Long Island Railroad commuter train, and going back to Manhattan or Brooklyn. They're walking a mile back to their unit, their tenement, to get some sleep for the night.
And who are the people? Do we know? Sort of. I mean, I'm imagining like an immigrant population. I'm imagining like who are the people? I'm just like that's decide. I'm doing that. I'm going to go out there and work for the rich people and live in the hinterlands, because it seems like that's a very particular sort of political economy that might drive them there.
Yeah, so that's a great point about political economy. It really came in two ways. First, it was sometimes these estate owners literally kind of recruited people, specialists, oftentimes Italian, for example, masons, or Polish gardeners, sometimes literally from Poland. The wealthiest estate owners literally they preferred to have people from Britain, because that looked like, what was that show on PBS for years? The Downton Abbey. They were looking for that kind of effect, right? You have a British speaking servant, so they were paid pretty well.
That's amazing.
Yeah, but it literally was just a hierarchy, and just like as you said in slavery, you had the people, the slaves that worked in the house versus the field servants, and you had this idea of like elite, British Isles servants in the home, Polish gardeners, Italian masons, and oftentimes the people at the farthest fringe were mostly Southern black Southerners.
Yeah,
and they were hired through like kind of family networks, sometimes literally from Southern resort areas. I'm trying to think of the one I have example of, but all throughout like South Carolina, North Carolina, like even like Asheville, for example, I'm thinking of lately.
Mm-hmm.
But all the winter resorts where the wealthy would go in the summer, sometimes these workers would begin working as a busboy or a stable worker, and then they would kind of move with the family up to work in Long Island, and then they would tell their cousins and brothers. And what I found in the census records is a lot of people came from the same town. They all come from a place in South Carolina, and they moved to Rockville Center in Long Island. And the whole block would be from 2 or 3 neighboring places in South Carolina. So yeah, it was through their own family networks, or they were sometimes literally recruited by the wealthy for a variety of reasons to kind of fit into their estate economy.
This is sort of an older book. I've used it a lot when I used to teach a class on the suburbs called Building Suburbia by Dolores Hayden. And she sort of like tracks, what I loved about it, sort of tracks the different phases of what we might call suburbs. But, thinking about those rich people living out in Long Island, I mean, how do we even think of that? Are those suburbs? Because in part, like they're not really commuting, working in New York and commuting back. It seems like, but the proximity to New York City does make sense, right? Like it is part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I always talk about how like Morgan, I think it was JP, I guess, or his son possibly, I can't remember which one. But the Morgans literally had a boat at the end of their home in Glen Cove, and they would commute to Wall Street every day from Glen Cove. So that proximity was important, because this was back in the day when business was still done in person, very, very, very explicitly, backroom deals and everything. So proximity was important. And I would argue Long Island truly was a suburb in that idea of being a place where people lived but didn't work before World War II. In that sense, right? You're consuming. It's a landscape of consumption. The people who do the labor are the working class, but they serve people who don't work there. They live there, and this is their escape from that. There's a book by Robert Fulkelson called Bourgeois Utopias, and the idea of how you create these suburbs, kind of this idea of creating these literal utopias, right? These landscapes and neighborhoods that are completely designed, almost like Disney World, designed to be perfect. And all the smokestacks and the working class, they're just put to the fringes, whether it's just over the fence or it's 15, 30 miles away. I think Long Island epitomizes that idea of suburbs at that point.
Yeah, that's God. That's such a great way of putting it. That like, you think, what is a suburb? And it's like, well, it's a place that tries to hide its production. A place that tries to hide the ugly elements of what made it, and so we can just and it leads to. I mean, God, it leads to a kind of politics that's I see today in my town, where it's just there are people who live here. They're just like they don't want to see anything that bothers them. They see a homeless person. They see uh, you know, collapsing infrastructure. They see, an Amazon factory going up. They don't like it. And it's sort of, it's a weird and intense form of denial of like what is producing your life.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that because like I kind of get into this in the book too, like because after World War II, that ideal remains. The ideal of suburbs as a place that's kind of far, right, is kind of safe and excluded from all those problems, is an ideal that suburbanites themselves subscribe to, even when it's patently not true, even in their own, literally their own homes, or at least on their own suburban block. Well, whereas the Morgans or the Fricks or whoever could at least create the mirage because they didn't see any poverty on their estate, and when they went to parties they didn't see it. They obviously ignored the people doing the work for them, but I can imagine where it feels that way. But when you get to after World War II and way more, 2 million people are there and it's way more modest, group of people, that poverty and that inequality it's there. But that old ideal from that, that landscape of the early 20th century, I think it remains. And it kind of is part of that suburban kind of aesthetic that people want
Yeah.
and demand and fight for, but it never really existed for the majority of people. And of course, it never will, obviously.
Right. I mean, it's just a contradiction in capitalism that just seems like, you want to pretend like you're in the utopia, but the utopia takes a lot of suffering to produce. You want to go to Whole Foods market and not think about the people who are producing all the food that's in there, and where they live. So let's get to that part of it because that post-war suburb, obviously that's the story that people have in their minds that, after the World War II, and correct me if I'm wrong about any of these details, but after World War II, this guy Levitt and Levitt and Sons, a builder, and it goes to Long Island to essentially create housing for GIs coming home from World War II. That's the story I know. But what you're doing is adding this layer of like that working class. So where are they as all that sort of stereotypical story is happening?
You mean the Levitts or the working class?
The working class, like this sort of underclass of people in Long Island. I imagine there's a sort of continuity in some respects, but at the same time, I'm imagining that the explosion of middle class housing in Long Island requires a whole different kind of mobilization of that working class.
Yeah, so it's funny. When you use the word working class, I kind of think of after World War II, the working class gets kind of bifurcated, right? Because the people who are buying these Levitt homes, by most definitions, a Marxist definition, even Eric Olin Wright or something, right? They probably would define them for the most part as working class. Sure, they're building equity and they're becoming property owners.
Yeah,
There
yeah,
is
yeah.
that element. But we always have to remember, like they're the first for most of them, they're the first generation of people who, and their families or anyone they know who owns property. So like we live in 2024, so we know well how valuable property, and in property inflation. But for many of these people, this is the first time they're owning. The idea of like having this asset and selling, and this is the primary reason for me owning this home, it's not in a lot of people's minds. They're experiencing it for the first time. When you look at most of the records in Levittowners, for example, they're mostly comparing their mortgage to their rent they used to have. They're not thinking of like the equity and then I can sell this for X amount of money. That calculation isn't there. You know
They're
what I'm
not
saying?
they're not flipping houses yet.
Yeah, no, I mean they actually are. It's funny. Another guy, Michael Glass, who's a scholar at Boston College, is looking at how quickly Levittowners are. The average, I think, Levittowner lives in the place for like 5 years before they move out.
So they're
Um,
upwardly mobile
they're up
people. Yeah,
exactly, and that's what
yeah.
I mean by it. So there is a upwardly mobile working class that's benefiting from these federal programs, the FHA, the GI Bill, and of course defense spending, which is really important on Long Island. However, there's this other working class who also labor. They spend a majority of their working waking hours working, and they don't get the benefit from those federal programs, but instead they kind of help buttress that prosperity. And so you talked about continuity. And two examples of that continuity between the working class before World War II and this kind of working class after World War II is both in building, construction labor, obviously to build those estates. There was a huge kind of teeming population of day laborers and road construction workers and all these people, many of whom were Italian, Irish, or increasingly, especially by the 20s and 30s, Black Southern workers moving north to build. And after World War II, when Levitt and Sons starts building, one thing Levitt and Sons, especially William Levitt, who was a son of Abraham Levitt, they were rabidly anti-union. So if you know the story about Levittown, Levittown's probably famous for three things, right? It's famous for bringing mass production to housing. So, for example, the Levitts would put together a lot of piping in a factory or pre-cut the wood and then dump it off on site. So you're not doing the work on site, and that saves time. They also kind of split up the work of different workers. There was an old story where they had, one painting truck would just have blue paint, the other one would have white, and they just go from house to house just doing the blue part and the white part. Anyway, that's one way they did it. The other thing, of course, is they built really small homes. And also unfinished homes. When you bought a Levitt house, the second story was just an attic, but it wasn't really an attic. They had stairs going to it, like full stairs. It was supposed to be a second story, but they didn't put any drywall or insulation or wiring. It's up to the homeowner. So in reality, a Levitt house is a 2-bedroom house, only 600 square feet. That's a small house. But of course, you could have double that if you built up the second story. But that's up to the homeowner. That's the second way they did it. But the third way they did it is the Levitts were rabidly anti-union. And they really saw unions as the kind of the stumbling block to building cheaper homes. And so what Levitt and Sons innovated in doing is they began hiring subcontractors, but telling the subcontractors, listen, we're not going to pay you for the hours you work. That's how they normally did it. We're going to pay you for a fee for every single home you complete. And so that meant that these subcontractors were incentivized to work as fast as possible and force their workers to work as fast as possible.
Ugh, yikes. Yeah.
And what's important here is construction labor was not covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act until 1961. So construction laborers were the only safeguard they had against exploitation was union, the labor movement. Mm-hmm. And if you know anything about construction trades, of course, there's a lot of up and down, right? They can do really, really well if they can kind of get the monopoly on labor. But of course, there's many ways in which builders can get around their work, right? And one of the big ways, of course, is bringing in workers from elsewhere, right? And kind of undermining and undercutting labor. And so what these subcontractors did is they went south, got to the same labor streams that the pre-war estate owners tapped into, and they brought Black workers north, and these workers built a lot of Levittown.
Wow.
And of course, the irony here is, of course, as you know, Levitt had those restrictive covenants. So even if these workers were paid a ton of money, they could have never bought a Levitt house because they were racially restricted. It was restricted to Caucasians. But there is some irony to these workers building homes they could never afford and were never allowed to live in, but they were really important.
Right. I was going to say that racial element of like Black people are not allowed to buy these houses seems like an important element at play here. And deep irony. But it's also like it's one that continues throughout the whole history of the suburbs. I think I read a quote from, I think it was Levitt himself, who was like, look, I'm a Jewish person. Like, I hate racism. I'm not a racist, and I don't want us to be in a racist society. However, this is about home prices, and like the sad reality is, if Black people live in these neighborhoods, white people won't buy the houses, and the property values will go down. And it's like that's a conversation that people are still having today. And that's truly insane. But that's, I guess, the admission is that, like, hey, we're capitalists, and this is how capitalism works.
Yeah, the funny thing about that quote, though, is that I feel like it was disingenuous, or I shouldn't say that. I would argue Levitt believed what he said. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. He believed what he said. But I think it's wrong in two ways. Number one, the quote specifically was, as he said, as a Jew, I don't have any prejudice in my heart. But I believe the rest of the quote was something like, if I sell a home to a Negro buyer, 90 to 95% of the white buyers would not buy in Levittown. I think that was something like that, which is kind of what you were saying. And number one, the fact that he had to defend the racial restrictive covenant did mean on one level, it wasn't as like just accepted by everyone as he claimed, 90 to 95%. The fact that it was controversial means it wasn't as just like, oh yeah, of course,
Right.
Secondly, there was William Cotter was a renter in Levittown, and he was a black renter, and the landlord who owned it was going to evict him, partly because of the covenant and all the other stuff. And some Levittowners did come to defense, and there was a kind of active movement in Levittown against those racial restrictions. Now, I'm not trying to say Levittowners weren't racist. Of course they were, absolutely, but it wasn't as ironclad. But the second thing is, let's just pretend he was right. 95% of the white community in Levittown was against it. The same year he was selling Levittown, there was a interracial housing development that was only about 6 miles east in a place called North Amityville. Yeah. And that was open to anyone. And in one weekend, when Ronek, the Romano brothers, opened up Ronek Park, 8,000 prospective black homebuyers went to look. So if Levitt decided, screw all those white homeowners that hate it, he could have easily sold the 17,000 homes to black homebuyers. You know what I'm saying? Like, he could have done that.
Right.
And so the idea that it's the consumer that is the problem is completely ridiculous, because by pure capitalist logic, he could have probably sold it even for more money, given there was a housing shortage and black home buyers were restricted. He could have made more money selling it to black home buyers.
And it's interesting also to note that after coming out of World War II, you do have a bunch of black GIs who are sort of in the same upwardly mobile mindset and arguably similar economic position as the white homeowners. They're just kind of kept out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's exactly right. And the fact that there's so few neighborhoods available to those, that rising black middle class, speaks to the demand. I mean, the prices skyrocket in these black neighborhoods because there's so little supply. And so that's exactly it. And so when Levitt said that quote, what he really should have said is, look, I'm following what is real estate practice and standard that has been going back to the 1890s, right? And this is what's in the FHA, policy and manual. And if I sell my homes to Negro buyers, I risk kind of threatening what is assumed to be a standard practice across the real estate industry. So really what he should have said is, this is what the real estate industry believes.
Yeah. Wow.
But he puts it on the consumer, and the home buyers. I'm not trying to.
So he's like, I'm not racist. It's the world that's racist, actually.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And my hands are tied. Yeah.
My hands are tied. And his hands are tied, but it's by powerful people in the real estate industry. It's not by the relatively less powerful home buyers who are purchasing Levitt homes, if that makes sense,
Right. So I love the idea of sort of complicating this notion of working class, because I don't really believe that, there's one monolithic working class, certainly not one that expresses any kind of solidarity that the left would want them to express. But at the same time, I just watched a clip from Bill Burr, the comedian Bill Burr, and he was pushing back against some commenters on his Instagram page who were saying, you're not part of the working class, Bill, because you're a rich comedian. And he was like, I am working class. I'm from Boston. I worked my whole life. Fuck you. I'm working class. Like that's his attitude. Yeah. And people are like, no, it's because you're rich now. And I'm like, okay, well, what is working class then? And how do we define that? But in the context of your work here and your, intervention on the kind of 1940s and 50s suburb in Long Island, I'm thinking about like, okay, well, in the estate period of Long Island that we had talked about, the earlier Great Gatsby period, it's servants. It's like the underclass is very apparent who they are. They're the people who are like serving these people. But how does that change for the post-war suburbs? Because as you mentioned, that now like the kind of we're kind of closing the gap economically between the people who live in Long Island and the people who work in Long Island. I'm kind of just wondering how you define that, because they're not. I assume that a lot of these people who are buying these houses don't have servants, but they are sort of benefiting from a class of people who are there that aren't buying these houses and are working for them in some way.
Yeah, so it's funny you talked about working class. It was something I struggled with a lot, like. The middle class, right, is this everyone's middle class, right? That's a common political thing, right? Everyone and everybody's fighting for the middle class. That's right. Kind of the way it's been described. And, I went into all the sociological stuff, Elric Olin Wright and others, and I kind of arrived. I talked to Judith Stein, my former advisor.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
R.I.P., right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, yeah. Unfortunately, she passed. Mm-hmm. of lung cancer. But the one thing she kept saying is, well, if you go to kind of the old Marxist Orthodox definition, right, it does include a much larger group of people, in the sense of people that work for a living. Like their livelihood depends on them doing labor, right? They don't own property, be it intellectual or, physical or whatever it may be. And therefore, what we think of as the middle class is really a working class who gets a level of comfort thanks to, as I argue in the book, the welfare state. And the American welfare state. And, the weird thing with I kind of call
that's
it
an ironic kind of way of thinking about it.
I know. And, the thing is, I definitely, I imagine people
are no, I'm not middle class because of welfare. I'm middle class because I got a good professional job. I went to college, it's like, no one wants to believe that they're middle class because of welfare, Tim.
I know. And it's funny because I do get pushback from regular folks, right? When I give presentations, and because again, they associate welfare with, food stamps and things like that.
Yep.
And I'm like, no, it's the idea of the state, right? Providing safeguards against, deprivation, and of course, providing a level of security and comfort so that people can deal with the vicissitudes of, we know the definition there. But the thing is, I included in my definition, which was pretty wide ranging, defense spending. Defense spending obviously is not normally seen as welfare in any real sense, right? Because it's to serve, the Cold War and the military state and the empire, essentially. However, it was always an undercurrent of discussion from especially World War II, which proved it, of the economic stimulus and the jobs created by the defense industry. And Long Island is, you live in Southern California, you know how important the defense industry was. It still is, even though it doesn't produce the jobs it did, it's still important in terms of, the kind of money that's spent in California. And so,
yeah. And whenever there's talk of closing the bases around here, there's a big fight. And it's not just a fight among people that are in the military. It's people that recognize a sort of economic strength that money provides.
Yeah. And so the big thing about the defense industry is it's highly politicized. Of course, everything's politicized, but the contracts are a political nature, right? It's not something you could blame on the market, right? Even when Robert McNamara tries to bring the market to the defense industry in the '60s, it's no, so the competitive element is between two or three contractors. This isn't a real competitive market in any definition.
I'm going to start a plucky nuclear weapons factory.
Yeah, exactly.
Garage, yeah, to compete against the
entrepreneurs, yes, of General Dynamics, yeah. And so, Long Island's one example of a place where I think 1 in 7 Long Islanders are directly working for the defense industry. And the numbers show that 46% of residents of Nassau County, Long Island's largest county, were indirectly or directly tied to the defense industry.
Wow.
And that's through Keynesian multiplier effects. So, the idea of if every defense worker pays taxes to support the teacher, in that way. And the calculations showed that it had that effect on about 46% of all county residents, the children, the teachers, the deli worker, everything else. So the point is that working class, people who go under planes and drill, screws into an aluminum plane fuselage, they're working class. They look just like an automobile worker in Detroit, but they enjoy a level of comfort unprecedented, I would argue, in human history, and it's thanks to those defense contracts and the FHA mortgages and builders like Levitt who are offering that to them.
This really complicates a very common idea I hear, on the left, liberals, whatever, for all my life, and I participated myself, and I think part of it is true. But the idea that we don't have anything good in America because we spend all of our money on the military. Right? It's all military spending. Instead of schools, we get military spending. But it seems like there's sort of more of a kind of connection between military spending and social spending.
Yeah. And so that's, I got into a lot of that research. I'm in no way an expert. There's a great book someday will come out by Tim Barker. I don't know if you've heard of Tim Barker, but anyone listening, read his Substack. It's fantastic. And he's really looking at military Keynesianism, really the first scholar to really study the history of military Keynesianism.
Awesome. That's great.
Yeah. And it's truly like an economic history. So it's going to be great stuff when it comes out. But just my kind of less steeped interpretation of it is that you're absolutely right. The guns versus butter debate is real, right? If that money was spent on social programs, we would be in a much better place. But the money that was spent still did have positive, and I mean positive in terms of people's living standards, effect on millions of people. I mean, 1 in 9 Americans were tied to defense in some way, to the military, to the Pentagon, or through defense contractors after in the 25 years or so after World War II. That's huge. That's bigger than the WPA, any other, it's the largest public jobs program, and I'm using public jobs, in quotes, the job creation tool. It was the job creation tool after World War II, right? At the end of all the New Deal public works programs and jobs programs, what replaced it was essentially military spending. And, whereas the president and the Cold War architects were spending that money to serve, various kind of, strategic interests, it was very clear when you go down the layers of Congress, from the Senate, then you get to the House of Representatives, and they're talking explicitly about the jobs purpose of defense spending. Many of the debates in the 50s and 60s was about like where the contracts go. One of the Hubert Humphrey was a big advocate on this thing called defense manpower. The idea of like we have to distribute contracts fairly to different states because like New York and California get way too many contracts. I want to go into Minnesota. I want to go to Michigan, and it kind of became this. This kind of pork spending. Just like a highway act would, or a PWA would. For these congressional representatives trying to get contracts for local industries. And it was so important for them. And, went all the way up to Leon Kaiserling, the Council of Economic Advisors, the head of it, the chair during the Korean War, who argued that like we can spend money and it doesn't produce inflation. And the most expedient way to do that is through the military. And they knew it was politically palatable to Americans to spend to the military. And there's a great book by Benjamin Fordham who argues that the Cold War consensus, basically the idea was that conservatives, the old-fashioned paleo conservatives, they didn't want welfare spending, but they were okay with military spending.
Oh,
this is what Michael Brennan talks about too, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Love Mike.
And whereas liberals, right, and were hawks, they were fighting the Cold War. Truman was a Cold Warrior, and they also supported welfare spending. And so here's a way we can get things passed. And we know the defense budget passes every year. There's rarely ever anyone really.
That is so insane. It's sort of like, okay, we're gonna build the death laser, but the building the death laser is going to provide a lot of jobs. We're gonna have great housing, and you're kind of like, okay, that's the way we'll do it. But there's something frightening about it. There's something very Kurt Vonnegut about it. It seems like.
Yeah, and I always think it's like, it's Keynes' nightmare, because when Keynes talked a lot about the dream of basically his ideas, right? The dream was that we'd all work 15 hours a week, and we would and we'd have tons of public amenities, cafes, and we'd have public shows and theaters. That was his idea, right? He talked about this idea of like this kind of leisure society where people are fully employed, but they're doing arts and creative work and things like that, right? And that was the old joke about we'll pay people to dig up holes and fill them, right? It doesn't matter what we do. Of course, what we should do is spend it on arts and creativity. And that was kind of Keynes' idea.
Sure.
But the real life application of his ideas was World War II. And that's the lesson that kind of came to be learned by politicians and even economists in policymaking positions was the way we're going to do this is through the military. And that kind of became the way in which jobs were produced. And it did create the security for millions and millions of Americans. And on Long Island, hundreds of thousands, in that way. So it kind of created this working class. But as you said, there was a whole other working class too.
So how does this shape Long Island as time moves forward? Because I think of like that original Levittown as just sort of the beginning of something much larger, right? Which is sort of like a working middle class living on Long Island, in endless tract neighborhoods, just like I see out here in Southern California. But also those places are supported by businesses, right? There's like commercial districts in these places. There's like there are people that are working out there and living out there, right? I mean, at some point, how does this sort of phenomenon shift as we move further into the 20th century?
Yeah, so the one thing that definitely is a big divide between before World War II and after World War II is the role of where people work, right? Whereas the middle class before World War II, and of course the elites, they work in the city. After World War II, it's not entirely true. In Nassau County, the majority of Nassau County residents don't commute to the city, workers. They work locally. In Suffolk County, which is farther east on Long Island, 85% of all Suffolk County residents worked on Long Island. Only 15% got on trains and went to Brooklyn, Queens, or Manhattan.
I
So it's a
do
vast.
think of that as like Long Island people, and this is a total stereotype, but
No, go
I've
for it.
been to Long Island. I've met plenty of people up there. I've spent time in barbecues and backyards in Long Island, and the
Right.
conversation is always like, "Fuck the city. I don't want anything to do with that place. I
Yeah.
don't go there. I will never go there." And it seems like it's not just like a I don't like to do that or I don't have to do that because I don't work. There's like an ideological like hatred of the city and what it represents, and a kind of doubling down on like we're here like that we're here because we're not that. And it seems like it has a lot more to more than just I don't know, the job part of it, if that makes sense. It's sort of like a resentment of everything the city represents.
Yeah, and that resentment. I can't speak to all the reasons. It's probably in some ways pretty deeply psychological.
Yeah.
And I don't know. The only way I could kind of speak to that is I don't know how to answer that in the 50s and 60s because the evidence in that period, especially the 40s, 50s, and 60s, is that a lot of Long Islanders are attracted. People are from New York City are attracted to Long Island because either they get a job on Long Island and then they move out here. That's true for like the big defense contractors, or it's literally cheaper to own a Levitt house than it is to rent in New York City. So it's a kind of an economic logic. And most of the evidence shows that. I feel like those beliefs about the city versus suburbs develop after they move. Once, I always say you
Oh,
always,
definitely. Yeah.
yeah, you always justify your decision after you make it, right?
Yep. You can hear it. You can hear the kind of like, oh, I did the right thing,
Yeah.
And I do feel like in some ways the suburban culture is a machine for producing that anti-city notion and all the kind of like, I don't know, racial and economic and social implications it has. It's funny. It's funny. I'm just like, I'm still thinking about Keynes and like the sort of like arts and culture thing. I mean, I guess Keynes sounds like such a hippie,
Yeah.
and it also pushes against that idea. And I don't know if it's true or not, but you hear it a lot. Like, the New Deal didn't solve the Great Depression. It was World War II and war mobilization that solved the Great Depression. And I've heard economists say, I don't know if that's true, and I'm not an economist and I'm not sure, but it seems like part of your story is kind of touching on that, right? That like that World War II was the mobilization that sort of created a sort of social engineering that the New Deal, for whatever reason, wasn't able to overcome.
Yeah, that's a great point. So there's a great book. I keep giving suggestions for books.
Yeah,
Everyone has
I love the book suggestions.
yeah, reading list after this class.
Yeah, there's a bibliography to this podcast.
Yeah. So there's a great book by Stephen Attewell. I have it over here. I can't remember the name. Let me just make sure I get the name because I want to make sure everyone knows it.
Yeah, grab it.
Yes, people must live by work. And unfortunately, he just passed away, unfortunately, from cancer as well. Young, too. It's terrible, tragic. But this book called Direct Job Creation in America from FDR to Reagan. And he makes the case, to me at least, I'm convinced, that the New Deal really did solve a lot of the depression. Like it wasn't perfect, but one of the big things, in case people don't know, is that the unemployment rates that we usually cite didn't include WPA workers, Works Progress Administration. It didn't include anyone that was working for a New Deal public jobs program at all.
Wow.
Yeah, and the idea was they're on relief, so they were trying to address how when the private sector recovers. So they just didn't include the numbers. But like, who says they're not productive members of society? They're building the infrastructure we still unfortunately rely on today.
Yeah, people ask all the time because I live in Ventura, California, and people that aren't from here, they're like, what do people do in Ventura, California? Like, what is the industry? There's no, like, where's the factory? Like that sort of thing. And if you look at like the Wikipedia page for Ventura, California, it's like most people are working for the government. Like most people work for the government. They work for hospitals. They work in education. I'm sort of like, okay, well, would that be similar to saying like, well, that's just relief. That's just government relief. Like, no, these are people with like careers, professional jobs, making good money. It's interesting that the WPA workers would not be included in the employment numbers.
Yeah, and he gets all into the politics of that. It was very politically fraught, obviously.
Right.
And so especially, I don't know if you know the Committee on Economic Security. They wrote this report in '34 that was kind of the blueprint for the American welfare state. And one of the things they write very explicitly is like, we want employment, like basically guaranteed employment, to be the core foundation for the American welfare state. The idea that like you are guaranteed a job, and if the private sector can't give you a job, the state will, the federal government will provide you a job. And so they envisioned WPA being permanent. It wasn't supposed to end. There was no end. It was part of the Social Security Act, actually. It was included in the Social Security Act. It wasn't a separate program. So it was a part of that whole idea of like cradle to grave. And and we can get into the idea of like, work as, the way in which we solve this. But that was kind of the movement. And that very much, obviously the New Deal wasn't Keynesian because Keynes was developing his ideas at the same time. But of course, Keynes thought very highly of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And obviously, Keynes's dream of everyone doing, is the federal arts program, right? It's the federal music program. It's what the New Deal did as well through the WPA. He envisioned that as a kind of extension. And so that does relate to defense, right? Because it's not that the Great Depression wasn't, I'll go as far as say, solved or at least kind of resolving as a result of the New Deal. Mm-hmm. It's that, of course, the spending, as we know, was never enough to really overcome that. And that's kind of, we know famously in 1937, Roosevelt cut back because he was kind of a budget balancer. And of course, that led to a recession again. And so they increased spending again. But Attewell makes a good point that up until 40, because the WPA ends in 43. So like 40, 41, the WPA was kind of getting stabilized and still stimulating jobs. But of course, war spending started pulling people out of the WPA because it paid more. And the WPA kind of became a training centers, kind of open up training centers to train people for war. So it kind of was a circumstance of history that idea or the programs that would sustain jobs disappeared and defense came to fill. Does that make sense? So
yeah, totally. Put down your paintbrushes and pick up a gun.
Exactly. And the funny part is what I found on Long Island is because defense was never, of course, primarily a jobs program, there were these cuts, there were these changes to contracts all the time. And every time this happened, there was a crisis in the jobs picture. Long Island workers, especially the unions, would be like, well, why can't we pick up the paintbrush again? Why can't this factory stay open and build buses for Long Island's horrible auto-dependent traffic? Why can't we build public transit? Why can't we use these factories for civilian ends and not just, making bombs and missiles to kill people in Vietnam?
Right.
Right. And of course, I'm not trying to say they are, peaceniks or anything, or hippies or anti-war protesters.
Of course,
they have their own self-interest at heart, but their self-interest does align with the idea of transitioning away from this dependence on this, killing machine. And they're like, hey, yeah, let's just get a grab bag, whatever we can get. Let's build a bridge. Let's do this. Let's do something that keeps us employed, keeps our skills useful. Rather than shipping our jobs to California, which was happening in the 60s.
Okay. So every historian, and I can't see yours because you have your background blurred, but every historian I interview has a copy of the Power Broker, Robert Caro's book on the shelf behind them as a totem of like, yes, I'm a historian. Yes, I do urban studies, blah, blah, blah. But like, Robert Moses is a figure that I think of a lot when I think of Long Island and the sort of structure of Long Island, the politics, etc. How does he fit into your story?
Yeah, so Robert Moses.
I say he, I mean like kind of like he and what he represents.
Yeah. So the Power Broker helps balance my bed. No, but it absolutely is in the house, not behind me, but it is somewhere else. Yeah, so it's funny because like Moses, a lot of his work on the island is in the 20s and 30s. So he sets up the parkway system here. He buys all the state parks. He makes Jones Beach a very famous state, beach state park here. And he's the one kind of buying up and using eminent domain against all those wealthy aristocrats, of the Gatsby era. So obviously he lays a foundation for Long Island, but one, he really kind of is part of that bygone era when Long Island was still a playground. Hence why he's building all the parks. He builds Bethpage State Park, which has a golf course they use for the U.S. Open every few years. And it was supposed to be a golf course for the masses. But what is a golf course for the masses? I mean, you know how much golf costs. You know what I'm saying? Like,
It's just a funny phrase to say, like golfing for the masses.
Yeah, and it's like...
I guess that's mini golf, actually, is golfing.
That would be golf, yes, for the masses. Yes, exactly. But it was and again, the parkways were for automobiles that were a luxury item in the 20s, relatively speaking. And the parkways forbid trucks, so it wasn't for industry. It was for people taking a pleasure drive out to a park to have a picnic. And in fact, Moses was basically, all he did after World War II was complain about the development on Long Island. That's all he did. He hated Levitt and Sons.
Oh, interesting. I think I've read this, but remind me of this because this is interesting.
Yeah, so like he basically was like, Levitt and some of these cheap homes are going up without any planning. the quality control is not there. And he said, you're creating slums as soon as, I forget, something about apple trees. Apple trees produce rotten apples or something like that. If they're left alone, basically, and not pruned. And he was convinced, like, these houses are going to be slums. Slums. And he was mostly incorrect, mostly. But he wasn't totally incorrect, because the Levitt houses were built cheap, and they required constant maintenance and improvement and upgrading. Of course, I guess what he didn't predict he was imagining people buy this home and it's just there. Like, it's a brick house and it stays there. But instead, of course, what it required was this constant sweat equity. You can't find a Levitt house today that's the original Levitt house. Like, they're all been augmented, changed, updated, everything else.
There's wiring in the attics.
Yeah, there's one. Absolutely, yes,
floor,
of course. Yeah. Usually the attic is dormered, and it has a back and everything else. But the point is, so Robert Moses kind of played this like bygone era, and a lot of complaining, and that's mostly what he did was write letters. And he even got involved in local like housing battles over like housing codes and things, and building codes, trying to fight suburban development, because he saw it as unplanned, and he wasn't wrong in that sense. A lot of this stuff was. Levitt and Sons basically pushed the town of Hempstead, where they built, to get rid of their basement code, so they didn't have to have a basement, and that's a way to make it cheaper. I'm not saying that's bad or good. It's just like, these developers had a lot of power to kind of get their landscape produced, and it was a battle against planners who kind of had to react to it, if that makes sense.
There's a bit. I'm looking at your the site for your book on the University of Chicago Press website, and one of the things that stuck out to me in the sort of synopsis of your book, it says federal mortgage programs help some families buy orderly single family homes and enter the middle class, but also underwrote landlord efforts to cram poor families into suburban attics, basements, and sheds. And I just thought that was really interesting, considering the fact that I'm renting a house in the suburbs right now, and there's an ADU, what we call it ADU, which is like an attached. What does an ADU stand for?
Accessory dwelling unit.
Accessory dwelling unit. Thank you. I love these. I love these names we come up with. For what they really are. But how does that play out in Long Island in the 1950s and 60s? Because it seems like that's what you're describing, is like this underclass that's sort of like hidden away. And the person that lives in the back of our house in half a garage, our landlord has cut out for them. They're getting ripped off. It's like they're spending a lot of money. And this is a person who I think has what we would call a very working class job, and they're sort of stuffed back there. And there's a visual metaphor going on there too, right? It's sort of like hiding the people in the garages and the basements.
Yeah, exactly. So we were talking about how there was this bifurcated working class, right? And the majority of this new working class were what we think of middle class, buying these homes. But the people who served them or worked in these low wage jobs, they lived on Long Island too, but they couldn't qualify for an FHA mortgage. You had to earn about $6,000 in the 1950s, roughly. A man had to, because women's income didn't, qualify for them for a mortgage until the 70s. So the man had to earn about $6,000. So there was about 200,000 Long Islanders who didn't make that much money. So the problem was Long Island they only had 658 public housing units. That's like nothing.
Not enough.
Oh yeah. It was suggested by a planning board is about 1% of the needed public housing units. So it's nothing. The tenements were getting knocked down for urban renewal, and they weren't great to live in anyway. But of course, when you have this demand for housing and there's no supply, people are going to find a way to make it for them. So essentially what happens is these Long Island homes, some of them in Levittown, kind of entrepreneurial, we'll call them entrepreneurial, homeowners, speculators, or whoever else, begin putting up drywall, separating rooms, and carving out apartments and basements and attics. Sometimes they put sheds in their backyard and put people into sheds. And this accounted for, in the 60s, about 1 in 20 of all housing units on Long Island were these illegal apartments. By the 70s, it was 1 in 10. And the most recent stuff in the early 90s says there was about 100,000 of these, what we call informal housing units or illegal apartments across Long Island. It's the main source of rental units. And I'm sure it's the case in Southern California too.
How poorly regulated are all those places? You know what I mean?
By definition, they're not regulated because, the FHA required that all homes that they were covered by insurance were supposed to be owner occupied. They didn't want to incentivize a rental market, which makes sense. They didn't want to allow speculators to buy up these homes, start renting them. So it was only for owner occupiers. That was the idea. So, and there were also building codes and housing codes and all these different codes that were put on all these homes, right? It's a regulated landscape. And so anyone making these apartments had to hide them. They literally had to hide them from building inspectors, from town assessors, and from neighbors, or at least, kind of tell neighbors to keep it on the down low. And so that's why it was in certain neighborhoods where these illegal rentals concentrated, tended to be Black dominated or integrated communities, where the conditions were all right for like landlords to come in and buy a lot of homes and start just chopping them up for multiple families. And so your point about unregulated, they were unregulated, and many of them were incredibly dangerous. I have stories of children dying in fires as a result of 4 families living in an 800 square foot house.
Didn't this happen in New York City recently with the flooded basements?
Yes.
Yeah, and they're like, well, why are 17 people living in this basement? And it's like, well, they're just poor people, and that's what they do. And it's like, no, like a certain sort of political economy created that awful situation where people are drowning in basements because there's too many people living there, and it's not safe.
Yeah. And the thing is, right, whereas, obviously this is happening in, 1940s South Side Chicago or in Harlem, for example, right, where landlords are chopping up. The idea of it happening in suburbs doesn't seem, it's like, no, why? That's the place where people get away from. They get away from those neighborhoods. But of course, it's going to happen anywhere where there just isn't the supply for people who can't afford that particular program, which is the FHA program, or couldn't afford to own in another way. So what you find is a lot of predatory loans in the 50s and 60s, the kind of rent to buy, lease to purchase schemes. And then some people are just buying up these homes and like, screw it, I'm not even going to own it and live in it at all. I'm just going to chop it up and rent it out. And they got away with it, because codes are hard to enforce. I use the term informal housing, not illegal apartment, because a lot of times these apartments weren't breaking laws. They just weren't conforming to codes like safety, housing codes. So how do you get someone to conform to a code? Well, you find them, you throw things on, you come and inspect again, make sure they change the code. And it's easy to get around that. You can slow that process down for years. You can sue. I had one example of a guy, Stanley Phillips, in a town, Roosevelt, Long Island, and he seemed to either bribe or fool the assessor. And he told the assessor that the mattress in the garage was used for boxing. Like the kids went on the mattresses and boxed in the neighborhood, when he had 5 families living in a like a 800 square foot house.
Jesus. Wow. That's low.
That's low. Yeah.
I mean, I lived in Sunset Park in Brooklyn for years and years, and living there, you could see that there were people doing this, that there were just like our neighbors specifically had just a ton of people living in their house. And there was one guy in particular, I'll never forget him. His name was Ernest. He was an older dude. I think he was a recovering drug addict. He was a super nice guy. I talked with him a lot. He told me that he's like, oh, I live in like a curtained off part of their basement where there's like a couple towels on the ground. I don't even have a bed. And I lay there and I was like, how much are they charging you for that? He said $800 a month. I'm like, hey, it's disgusting, honestly. And I'm like watching these people who didn't live in the house. They would come in and check because they lived in the suburbs. I don't know if it was Long Island, but they would come into Brooklyn and check on their property where they had all these poor people living in a house that was so sectioned off that it was just curtained off areas for people to sleep on the floor. It's pretty gross.
Yeah. And that, again, that happened in the, tree-lined suburbs of Long Island because it's the same process that happens in New York City, right? There's just a tight housing market, no rentals available, and people exploit that, but the thing about what I argue in the book is that it produced a weird politics. I imagine these politics happen in Brooklyn and Manhattan too. But the one thing I would imagine in Sunset Park is very few people in Sunset Park would say, we got to get, we want the neighborhood to be all single family homeowners, but that structure and the expectation that this is a place of single family homeowners, a neighborhood of single family homeowners, was the thing that the people who oppose these illegal apartments used. They would say, like, it was kind of weird, create these weird coalitions where you had like black and white homeowners joining together and arguing that the town is being racist by allowing people to chop up homes in their neighborhood. And why don't they have these people living in white neighborhoods? So they would kind of make this argument like, we've suffered under racism and discrimination for years, And now there's a new form of discrimination because these people are disproportionately renting in our neighborhood, and they should be spread around to white neighborhoods. So like we should be able to enjoy the same middle class suburbia that Levittowners are, and we're being deprived of it. So they kind of use a class analogy. They use racism as a way to do it.
I mean, God, I mean the neighborhood that my parents still live in, the house that I was raised in, is a now an older tract neighborhood that was built in the 1970s. Very classic California suburbs, but the politics is very anti-renter. You know, we hate the renters that are coming in. We don't want renters. We want owners. And I always kind of found that obnoxious. But as time has gone on, the neighborhood has gone down in its sort of I don't know, visual and aura, because there are so many people packed into these houses, and it's no longer, you go to that neighborhood, it's almost like Robert Moses's sort of fear that there's like a slum element going on here. There's trash everywhere. There's simply too many people living in these houses. And that part of it creates, a reactionary politics. And you're kind of like, okay, well, that reactionary politics isn't really aimed at the problem.
No.
But it's sort of reacting to the symptom. And that's what's so frustrating about it, I guess.
Yeah, and it's weird because it creates weird bedfellows too, because like the tenants organize with the landlords.
Right.
and they're allied, and the county social services department, they're all on one side of it, and on the other side are the homeowners and the town politicians, who are on the other side. And it's like, well, the landlord and the tenant are usually opposed to each other, but because there's, the tenant's survival depends on the landlord, who's more powerful to kind of support them, it produces these really, really weird politics. And as a result, kind of what ends up happening is nothing, in the sense of like it just continued to proliferate, and it's only expanded since then, like you're saying.
Well, yeah, and I think the thing that popped out to me most in doing any kind of research for my suburbs classes over the years was the fact that more people live in what we call suburbs in America than rural or city locations combined. It's just kind of like the baseline. It makes you think a lot about like sort of like the Trump politics and that kind of that kind of particular conservatism might be sort of related to the fact that people live this way.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that though, because I think since 2000, more poor people live in suburbs than in cities or rural areas too. So
Amazing.
It's not,
wow.
Yeah, it's not just the majority of people; it's also the majority of poor people.
Yeah, wow, that's so great. I mean, that's kind of the point of your whole book, I think.
Yeah, to find the origins of that, exactly. And so,
I mean, isn't that insane? Because I think the typical suburban thought is that like, oh, the poor people are in the city, and that's why I don't want to be there. And yet they're really in the suburbs.
Yeah, but I think the difference,
the suburbs too, I should say.
Yeah, suburbs too, exactly. Yeah, but the difference, of course, is, I would argue, that kind of number one, obviously the visual element, right? Homelessness is more hidden and things like that in suburbs. It's lesser number. They concentrate in city centers and things like that. So the visual nature of poverty is different. But I'd argue for a city like New York, people of lower income have more rights, so they're more of they actually have more of a little more political power. And because so many people who are poor on Long Island, or where you live in Southern California, they're living illegally, for example, they don't have any recourse. They have no power at all. They can't even, there's no tenants court, housing court. There's no legal services. Everything's a handshake. So they're really powerless, and so therefore they're extra hidden. They don't have a voice. They're not going to go to a town board meeting and expose themselves.
Right? Yeah, the suburban poor seems like a landscape of the future to keep.
It is, unfortunately. Yeah, it is unfortunate. I mean, I just in my one date I had in Long Island. They estimate by 2043, it will no longer be dominated by what we think of as the middle class, like people of middle income. It'll be evenly split between high income and low income Long Islanders. So we're kind of returning to that Gilded Age. And it makes sense. Of course, the United States is as well. So Long Island just is emblematic of that return in that way.
Wow, that's such a great summary of what we've talked about today. I want to say the name of your book, Tim, again before we go here. Tim Keogh. The book is In Levittown's Shadow: Poverty in America's Wealthiest Post-War Suburb. I'm so glad you and I got to talk, Tim. This is fun.
This is an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate being on here. As I told you before, I'm a huge fan of the show. News Trap is the main way I get news
Oh,
now.
no.
I know that might be scary to you,
Yeah.
but like, I wrote off the news during the pandemic. I was like, I'm so sick of reading this stuff. And I'm like, well, this is my nice little curated, exactly what I'm interested in,
Cool.
every week. So it's great stuff.
Well, I'll keep putting them out, and we can talk again. I'd love to have you back. We can talk more, because I feel like there's other things we can touch on. But thanks so much for being here.
Absolutely. Pleasure's mine. Thank you.
Well, all right, my friends. I think that's going to wrap it up for Nostalgia Trap today. I want to thank my guest, Tim Keogh, for coming on and having a really great conversation. I enjoyed that immensely, and I hope you did too. There's lots more Nostalgia Trap stuff out there, so go check it out on our Patreon page, etc. I'll put all those links in the episode description. And again, we will be talking more specifically about our analysis of Trump's stunning, gross victory on Tuesday on the News Trap episode for tomorrow. That's Friday, November 8th. Check out our Patreon page. We appreciate it, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.